Now we come to the end of the book of Zechariah, the last two visions, which are quite different than what we have been discussing at this point. Early on, I mentioned that the book of Zechariah falls naturally into two areas, the dated visions, which we have now just finished, and then the undated visions at the end of the book. And because these visions are of a particular literary genre, we need to talk a little bit about that writing style. They have the character of what has come to be called Jewish apocalyptic. Apocalyptic is a style of writing which uses a number of symbols, a number of unique literary features that would become actually much more widely used 2 or 3 centuries after the time of Zechariah. But this part of Zechariah, at least, is very much like some of those later writings. And I want to spend just a few moments talking about some of the primary characteristics of apocalyptic writing because it is very similar to what we find in the book of Zechariah. In the first place, apocalyptic literature gives us a number of special disclosures in which the prophet is enabled to see behind the scenes of what is visible history into what is happening in the invisible world. So in these kind of special disclosures, there are descriptions of things by angels, sometimes descriptions of things that are in the spiritual world that are not immediately apparent in the visible historical world. Furthermore, there is often what is called a dualism of powers, in which there is the power of God and his angels and good opposed to the power of evil and Satan and his minions. And so there is a very strong conflict going on in apocalyptic literature between what is evil and what is good. There's also a dualism of ages, a very marked presentation of time in which the present age is largely given over to the power of evil, but the future age that is coming will be given over to blessing by God. And there will be a very sharp change between the present age and the future age. And the transition between the present age and the future age is often described in very cataclysmic terms, in terms of war, in terms of the collapse of the universe, those kinds of ideas. So this dualism of ages is very apparent. The idea of this age, but then the idea that there is an age to come. There's a lot of symbolism in apocalyptic literature, particularly symbolism of animals and symbolism of numbers. Numbers have schematic value, they have symbolic value much more than mathematical value. And animals are often used to represent political powers or individuals or someone in historical circumstances, but they are symbolized by animals. There's a lot of cosmic disturbances. Apocalyptic literature sometimes talk about the falling of the stars from the heavens and the moon turning to blood and the sun being darkened and the collapse of the heavenly spheres. So a lot of things are happening in the universe, not just simply in human history. And there is a marked emphasis on angels and demons. There will be the powers of evil will be represented by demonic forces and the powers of good by angel forces, which are on the side of God. And there is also sometimes a messianic figure, not necessarily called by the term Messiah. Sometimes, for instance, one of the apocalyptic works uses the term Son of Man to refer to this figure. But it is a champion, some kind of figure that represents the power of good and whom God uses as his personal representative to oppose the forces of darkness. As we look at apocalyptic literature as a collection of literature, we find that this literature has roots in the Old Testament, particularly in what is called the Little Apocalypse of Isaiah, and also in the two visions that we're going to look at in Zechariah. And then also in the book of Daniel, the vision of the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream, the image of the 4 beasts, the image of the 70 weeks, and eventually the image of the kings of the north and the south. All of these are kind of the roots of apocalyptic literature. By the time the Apocrypha is being written, which are books in the intertestamental period, there is at least one of those books that is written in apocalyptic style, which is called 2nd Esdras. But then as you move toward the 2nd and even up into the 1st century BC and during the time of Jesus, there's a whole range of literature that now is being produced by the Jews that has been collected in what is called the pseudepigrapha. This collection includes many apocalypses. You'll notice the apocalypse of Abraham, the apocalypse of Adam, the apocalypse of Elijah. First Enoch is an apocalypse. All of these are in this style of writing. Now, the book of Zechariah does not participate in all of the primary elements of apocalyptic style, but it does have enough connections with that style that is probably appropriate to talk about this literary genre at this point. When you get to the New Testament, of course, there's going to be one book in the New Testament that is written in this style, and this is the Apocalypse of John, which we typically call the book of Revelation. So with that kind of just a brief introduction to apocalyptic literature as a literary style, let's take a look at these two oracles that finish off the book of Zechariah. These oracles are 3 chapters apiece. The first one, 9, 10, and 11. The second one, 12, 13, and 14. So as we look at this first oracle, we're going to see that one of the immediate differences between the first and second parts of the book of Zechariah is while the first section has a very strong sense of immediacy with respect to the building of the second temple. It is telling the people to let your hands be strong, be part of the work, be involved, don't lose your vision, don't lose your focus, continue to build the temple. That's all very evident in the first half of the book of Zechariah. But now as we move into this second part of the book of Zechariah, this is much more ambiguous, much more looking at the future with kind of a soft focus rather than a hard focus. It seems very applicable to some kind of future era, although the actual time of that era is not directly described. This second section, as I mentioned, contains the 2 lengthy oracles that each begins with the Hebrew word masah. This is a word that means burden. This means the message is going to be heavy. It's going to be severe. It's very much like the term that is used in the book of Habakkuk, who also talks about his vision as something that is a masah, a burden. And so this genre will be to some degree apocalyptic, and it's going to be largely poetic, at least particularly in the first of these visions. There's going to be extensive use of imagery and symbolism. And so when we look at the figures in these 2 visions, we need to keep very much in mind that the images that are used are calling us to look behind those images as something that is not immediately apparent. The first vision begins with a judgment on the peoples who surround the ancient land of Israel. It begins with a description of a northern invasion. However, this is different than the northern invasion that happened that led to the exile. In the exile, the northern invasion was, of course, the troops of Nebuchadnezzar coming south to destroy Jerusalem and Judah. In this vision, who is coming south is the Lord himself, and he is conquering every city on his way to Jerusalem. So there's an immediate parallel between the invasion of Nebuchadnezzar and now the coming of the Lord, except that the coming of the Lord is going to be not of the sort that will end in the destruction of Jerusalem, but will end up with other kinds of things. But if you look at the path of the coming of the Lord, he comes from Hadrach in northern Syria, then through Damascus, Hamath, then Tyre and Sidon on the coast, the north coast near Galilee, and then finally to the Philistine cities down in the south coast plain of Palestine, Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Ashdod. And then in this description of God's invasion, there is a really surprising element in chapter 9, which is directed toward the Philistines of all people. Now, as you remember, the Philistines were kind of the perennial enemies of Israel. They go back to the time of Samuel and the late period of the Judges. You find it, of course, in the book of Judges and the stories about Samson. And it is David who is in conflict with the Philistines. Everybody knows the famous story of David killing the Philistine giant by the name of Goliath. And now, however, when God comes to invade and invades Philistia, he says, I will take away its blood from its mouth and its abominations from between its teeth. Now that's a really strange passage to most Westerners at least, but that really is a way of saying that the Philistines will now be cleansed of their non-kosher food consumption. The Philistines then, this is a way of saying that they will be converted. They will now follow the laws of Israel, and they will no longer eat non-kosher foods. Of course, the Philistines, by their own culture, didn't observe Israel's laws. They did eat blood, they ate pork, they ate all kinds of things that the Israelites were forbidden to eat. But now this is going to be taken away, and the Philistines in Philistia will be called a remnant for our God. What an incredible vision for the future, that the Philistines, once the perennial enemies of Israel, are now going to be a remnant for God. And Philistia will be like a clan in Judah. And Ekron will be like the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem, whom David took and who incorporated as his capital city. This is such a surprising element in this passage, but it does speak to the themes that we've already looked at, in which God is going to reach out to the nations to bring them to the faith of Israel. And during this war then, God is going to protect his people and his temple in Jerusalem. Here are the cities, if we look at them on a map, that shows the invasion of God into Palestine: Hadrach, Hamath, Sidon and Tyre and Damascus. These are the Syrians and the Phoenicians. And in the next map, I show you the four cities of the Philistines: Ashdod, Ekron, Ashkelon, and Gaza. And of course, these are the cities that are now going to be cleansed. They are cities that are now going to be incorporated into the people of God and will become part of the remnant. Associated with this invasion of Yahweh is the arrival of a new king to Jerusalem. This is not the old king Nebuchadnezzar coming in. This is a new king. And everything about this king is going to be strikingly different than was to be seen in the old invasion. In fact, he's going to come as a righteous and a gentle king, riding on a donkey, the symbol of peace. Now that's such a striking passage too, and we often read this passage at Christmas time or in connection with the Messiahship of Jesus, particularly on Palm Sunday when he comes in to Jerusalem riding on a donkey. The important thing is that he is coming as a gentle, righteous king, and that is symbolized by his riding on a donkey. A donkey is a domestic animal. A donkey is not used for war. Donkeys are used for plowing fields, for riding, that sort of thing. And so it's important that the new king that is coming down to Jerusalem is not coming on a horse. He's coming on a donkey. Horses are invariably used for war, for violence in the ancient Near East, either to pull chariots or for cavalry. But this king is coming riding on a donkey, the symbol of peace. And the implements of war are going to be cleansed from both the north and the south. Ephraim, which is the primary tribe in the north, is going to be cleansed, and Jerusalem, which is the capital of the south, is going to be cleansed, and universal peace will be established for all of the nations of the world. Then, as you move toward the end of chapter 9 into chapter 10, the vision of war returns. God will rescue his prisoners of war, and he would empower them against the Greeks, which is the term Yavan, Greece and the nations of the Aegean, which is sort of a symbol of the far-off islands, the far-off peoples that are at most distant from the people of Jerusalem. And in a striking theophany, God will appear to defend his people and to save his flock. And he will restore them to their rich heritage, and he will fill them with blessings. So, this victory that is coming is going to be in spite of some bad leadership among the Jews. One of the problems that the Jews had faced for much of their history had been the problem of false shepherds or false leaders. The term shepherd is often used as a metaphor for kings in the ancient Near East or other kinds of leaders. And of course, Israel had been subjected to a series of really bad kings in the northern nation. There were only bad kings. In the southern nation, there were a few that were good, but most of them were bad. And their priests were bad. Their prophets were often false prophets, leading the people astray. And so without any good, sound leadership, the Israelites had fallen into idolatry and paganism. But now Yahweh himself is going to become a good shepherd to the flock of Israel. So as you read in the beginning of chapter 10, in verse 2, therefore the people wander like sheep, they are afflicted for lack of a shepherd. But in place of their leaderless circumstances, God himself is going to become a good shepherd to his people. He's going to empower both the north and the south. He's going to regather them from Egypt and from Assyria and from all of the nations, and he's going to lead them in a second exodus of redemption. Just like at the Red Sea, where God gave them victory, in this second exodus, God is going to give them victory. And so at the beginning of chapter 11, you have what is sometimes called a taunt song. A taunt is a mockery of an enemy. And this is a 3-verse mockery of the enemies of the people of God. In this larger vision, there are some images that connect with the past of Israel. Some of them fairly clearly, some of them maybe not quite so clear, but we want to talk about them because they are described particularly in verse 4 of chapter 10. These images are the cornerstone, the tent peg, the battle bow, and every ruler or every commander. Now the first two of these are fairly easily linked to things that were in earlier oracles of the prophets. The cornerstone, of course, comes up in the book of Isaiah as the tested stone in Zion. It's also described in the Psalms as the rejected cornerstone. So this new leader is going to define his leadership by some of these past images. The tent peg also goes back to Isaiah 22, where there was a peg driven in the wall securely. The peg will eventually be broken in the book of Isaiah, but there is this hope in the future that there will be a solid tent peg that will be driven into a secure place. And this is a way of talking about the dynasty of David. The dynasty of David will be like this secure tent peg. And so the new king that is coming is going to be like that. The battle bow is a little less clear as to what that might be connected to, but one good possibility is at the death of Elisha. When Elisha was dying, he was visited by the king of Israel, and he had him shoot arrows, which he called the arrow of the Lord's victory. And perhaps this image here of the battle bow is a recall of the arrow of the Lord's victory. And then, of course, there is the phrase about every ruler. All of them together will be like mighty men in battle. This may relate to the idea of the scepter of Judah, which is back in the book of Genesis chapter 49. Again, this last one is a little more ambiguous, so that one is not so easily connected as the first two of these. But together, all of these images define Israel's new leader, the new king who is coming. Then as we pick up in chapter 11 and verse 4, this final section is in 3 movements, and it is actually going to shift from poetry to prose, except for a final stanza in chapter 11. This is going to use the image of shepherds and flocks. And the flock is Israel, and the shepherds are the leaders of Israel. In the first movement of this vision, the Lord calls upon his prophet to act out the role of a good shepherd to a flock that has been severely ravaged by bad leadership. The whole history of the nation of Judah is a history of bad leadership, some of them particularly bad. Manasseh, probably the worst of the lot. But now God says, I want you to act out the role of a good shepherd to the flock that is now so damaged. In doing this, you will use your shepherd staffs. Of course, shepherds use a crook or a staff, and he has 2 of them called by the names favor and unity. These are symbols of his gracious care to the flock. He will bestow upon them his blessing and his favor, and he will bring them together in unity. And in fact, there will be 3 shepherds who are not worthy shepherds that he will actually get rid of. He will dismiss them because they are bad shepherds. Then in the second movement of the narrative, the flock that is now shepherded by a good shepherd is going to actually reject the good shepherd. And so he in turn is going to be shut out from them. He is going to break his shepherd staff called favor. So the favor of his blessing to the flock is now going to cease because they have rejected him. And he asked for his wages, but he's paid the price of a slave. which is 30 pieces of silver. So with a sarcastic comment, he says, he calls it this lordly price. This is the language you find in the ESV, this lordly price. But it isn't a lordly price. This is a sarcasm. It's actually the price of a slave. So instead of working for them and receiving appropriate rate wages, he is given the price of a slave and sent on his way. And so he throws the money to the temple potter for his use because it's such a small amount. Then he breaks his shepherd's staff called union. The union of the people of the flock is now broken. Which takes us then to the third movement of this narrative, in which the prophet is now instructed to play the role of a worthless shepherd. He's played the good shepherd, now he's going to play a bad shepherd. And in this role, what is going to happen to the flock is going to be disastrous after they have rejected the good shepherd. And then the narrative ends with this final stanza of poetry that pronounces a curse upon the worthless shepherd. Well, this last part of the oracle has been very intriguing for readers for many centuries, and I suppose I can point to about 3 general approaches of interpretation, and you need to consider each of these in turn. The first one is what I would call the historical approach. Here, the vision of the good shepherd and then later the bad shepherd and the breaking of the staffs and so on, this vision is located in the history of Israel leading up to the exile. Or it might even be in the post-exilic period leading up to the Maccabean revolt, when the Maccabees revolted against Judas Maccabeus. But in either case, it is an attempt to try to find some historical circumstance that lies behind this vision. A second approach is what I would call the futuristic approach. Here, interpreters try to locate the meaning in the life of Jesus of Nazareth, or perhaps even at the end of the age, which is still to come. But in some way, they project this idea of the shepherd, the good shepherd and the bad shepherd, to be somewhere into the future. And then there is what might be called the spiritual approach, where the wars are just simply treated as symbolisms, but in particular symbolisms of the missionary spread of Christianity. This was a popular idea among some of the second generation reformers. You find it in commentaries like Matthew Henry, those kinds of things, where they really take this as symbolisms of the progress of the Christian church. So what I want to do is I want to take each of these methods, the historical, the futuristic, and the spiritual, and sort of give you an example of each of these in a particular way. So here's a historical interpretation of the shepherd's narrative, at least one possibility. In this case, the flock that is marked for death goes back to the period of the judges, when the people of Israel are marked for death. The staves of favor and union, blessing and the bringing together of the tribes, then would symbolize the united monarchy that comes together under the leadership of Samuel, Saul, David, and Solomon. However, the union is compromised during the time of the end of Saul's kingship, because Saul has left off his primary responsibility of defending Israel against the Philistines. He is searching after David. Eventually, he's going to die on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. And after that, his son Eshbaal and his general Abner continue to try to carry on the war with the house of David. And those would be the 3 shepherds that are dismissed: Saul, Abner, and Eshbaal. The breaking of the 2 staves of favor and union then would describe the rupture of the monarchy after the death of Solomon. Rehoboam, who is the son of Solomon, insults the northern tribes, and they break off and form their own nation under the leadership of Jeroboam. The subsequent shepherds, who are evil shepherds, are the evil kings of Israel and Judah. And finally, the worthless shepherd would be Zedekiah, the last ruler in Jerusalem, who deserts the flock by trying to escape through a hole in the wall, eventually is discovered by the Babylonians and is arrested. So that particular approach to understanding this vision of Zechariah is an approach that looks toward the past and tries to find historical circumstances that might fit the vision. A messianic interpretation of the shepherd's narrative, which actually looks to the future, is very different. Here, the flock that is marked for death would still be the people of Israel, but particularly during the oppressions of the Greeks and the Romans, things that are still to come. During the time of the Greeks, of course, the Jews face a massive attempt to eradicate their religion by the Syrian Greek ruler whose name is Antiochus Epiphanes. He comes into Jerusalem, he sacks the city, he desecrates the temple, he forbids circumcision, he burns the Torah scrolls, he erects a statue of Zeus in the temple. All of these kinds of things happen during the Grecian period. And then later the Romans will come in and will take over Palestine under Pompey the Great in 63 BC. They will then control the priesthood. They will control the people with taxes. And it's during that time then that the Good Shepherd appears. The Good Shepherd in this view is Christ Jesus. He is rejected by his own flock, his own people. He came into his own, as it says in the opening of John's Gospel, and his own did not receive him. And the dismissed shepherds would be various messianic pretenders in the first century, people who claimed to be Messiah but were false messiahs. We run into a couple of them mentioned briefly in the book of Acts chapter 5, one called Judas the Galilean and the other called Theudas. Both of these are false messiahs. There are others, however, that are described in some detail in the writings of Flavius Josephus. And so the shepherd abandons them to their fate, which eventually is going to be the destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple by Titus Vespasian. So the first Jewish revolt and the destruction of the Second Temple arise in the 60s AD and culminates in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. And the evil shepherd in this particular case is going to be the leader of the Jewish revolt against Rome, a man by the name of Simon Bar-Giores. Now, one other interpretation, this one I've called the dispensational interpretation, which stretches all the way to the end of the age. Here the flock that is marked for death refers to the persecution of the Jews and the great tribulation at the end of the age. The good shepherd, again, is Christ, who is rejected by his own flock. The dismissed shepherds are messianic pretenders, but here they are messianic pretenders at the end of the age, such as the words of Jesus who said, "Many will come in my name and saying, I am the Messiah, and they will deceive many." The Jews will be abandoned to the persecution of the great red dragon and the beast, which are described in the book of Revelation. And the evil shepherd is the Antichrist at the end of the world, the one whom Paul calls the man of lawlessness and whom John calls the beast from the sea. Now, in just a moment, we will talk about some of the New Testament references to this first oracle.